cinema is a visual art, really. I know you've got to have the sound, but I mean, visually, films have to be interesting. Stanley was a master of that.
He was a photographer, first and foremost. He was an artist, and he loved to make pretty pictures, and he got very excited about that.
There was pressure. It was always hard to satisfy such a demanding man. On the other hand, if you're able to, it is also very satisfying. He was very exacting, and he knew exactly what he wanted. Not initially necessarily, but once he had made up his mind.
He was a perfectionist. And with Barry Lyndon, you had to have that perfection.
I don't know what led me to make any of the films, really, that I've made. I just became interested in them when I read them or when I thought about the subject. It should be an interesting story. The character should be interesting. It should offer possibilities for cinematic beauty in terms of photography and editing and visual things. It should give the actors opportunity to display emotions, and it should be, in the end, truthful and honest in dealing with the thematic material. In the end, you know, it does become this very indefinable thing like, why do you find one particular girl attractive, or why did you marry your wife?
If you look at the story of Barry Lyndon, which is a big novel by Thackeray, the first job...
In advance of important plot changes, it made the twists and turns of the story somehow seem more inevitable and less popping up like a jack-in-the-box by him anticipating major changes and warning you about them. There is a different kind of suspense.
How do I realize it?
Research was essential to every film that he made. In fact, it was like he would choose a subject to make a movie out, and then he became an expert on that subject.
Of course you use material from the time, and you have fantastic drawings of all the details, how these rooms looked like.
He had every art book, every book on paintings and landscapes and history and costumes and clothes and details down to playing cards, and he knew his subject.
I think I destroyed every art book that you can buy in a bookshop by tearing the pages out and sorting them out. I created a picture file of thousands of drawings and paintings for every type of reference that we could have wanted. But it is fun accumulating the information. You know, it's part of the problem that you have to learn something about something that you start off knowing very little about.
The biggest problem was filming with candlelight. That was a key part of creating the atmosphere and the look of that period.
What are the odds, gentlemen, that I live to see Mr. Barry hang yet?
Historical films offer possibilities of doing the sort of things that movies do better than anything else, you know, recreating atmosphere, just as futuristic films do.
Oh!
Something that I've always been very bothered by in period films is the light on interiors is so false. When you see a room that's entirely lit by candles, which they had to be, it just looks completely different, and it's, of course, very beautiful. You know, there's no way of putting filters on lamps to make it look like candlelight.
10 times their value and purchased pictures.
When Stanley read in The American Cinematographer about a lens that NASA used and was made by Zeiss, he was incredibly excited. His very, very fast lens allowed him to actually do this, to light a set with candlelight.
That was revolutionary, I think, definitely. But that was typical Stanley of getting those lenses, getting Ed DiGiulio to put them on a BNC camera. That's the sort of thing that Stanley was very, very clever at.
Costumes were a big topic, because what Stanley didn't want is this kind of stiff costume look of newly made costumes. He was very impressed by the immigrants and the new land. And he thought, this is amazing how the costumes look like it's the real thing. It's not, new. So he, in fact, called Jan Troell. He said, this is Stanley Kubrick. Jan Troell hung up. He thought it was a prank. Well, he finally got him on the line and said, don't hang up. He asked him, who did the costumes? And he said, oh, this was done by Ella Britt Söderlund. How did she do it? Well, she aged the material, she dyed the material, so it had this real flow and looked like used clothes, which is so essential. So we hired Ulla-Britt Söderlund, and she did that job, working actually for our costume designer, which was Milena Canonero.
The costumes were all copied from paintings. None of the costumes were, quote, designed. I think this has become the only sensible way to do historical costumes. It's stupid to have, a designer interpret the 18th century.
The costume detail was incredible. Beautiful materials, hand-dyed silks, hand-embroidered buttons. You would see Milena sitting there hand-embroidering buttons for the costumes.
Milena not only made and designed, she also looked for costumes in museums and to borrow them. Some of the costumes in Barry Lyndon are period, are originals. They were not copies. They were actually 18th century waistcoats. The military uniforms were also a mixture. Some were copies, some were originals.
Stanley wanted to make sure that the aristocrats, i.e. Maurice and Berenson, looked right. All the aristocrats, especially at that time in England, the families were always pure white. The servants inside were white. Why, there was a special white makeup that Anne Brodie had designed.
Samuel, what would the time be?
25 minutes past 11, milady.
First, he wanted to do it in Hertfordshire in England because he didn't like to travel. And it became quite clear. I mean, very soon, you just cannot limit yourself to Hertfordshire. It's just not possible.
Originally, the film was going to be entirely shot in the UK. Suddenly, a decision is made, quite last minute as well, to move the production entirely across to Ireland.
The key part was it had to look right for the late 18th century. And you cannot fake that.
Ken Adam was a production designer on the movie, and he had originally wanted to build sets. But he and Stanley decided on locations, and Stanley wanted the patina and the atmosphere that real old houses can provide. I was this, 19-year-old without a specific job to do, and I had already been taught how to take photographs by Stanley. So he said, right, you can go and start looking for locations. I started in Ireland because that's where they started filming. And so myself and a team of 4 or 5 other photographers were sent across the Irish countryside photographing locations and stately homes. The guidelines that we had were paintings of the period so that we could see what the interiors of houses were like, and of course the countryside. And the special instructions were, we don't want to see any signs of modern life. But he always wanted to see 360. So each roll of film was slated, what house it was, and the map coordinates, and what time of day it was, and very specific information.
The pre-production phase will have taken at least 15 months. So we're talking a year and 3 months, maybe even a year and a half before the cameras roll.
What happens, of course, with Stanley is we would sit down before a movie and lay out how long we think it's going to take, Now, then you'd think, well, got to take twice as long. That's a certainty. Can't take less. We didn't really have all the locations in place as we would have had because we hadn't been to Dublin to look at the locations there. None of that had been settled apart from going to Dublin Castle, which is an obvious place to shoot. And also the screenplay not being written, basically. Script that thick, with one scene in one page, with just a description of the scene and no dialogue in loads of it. I mean, that was when we started shooting. That was all really in trouble. The Waterford was a wonderful place, very scenic, beautiful scenes. Not easy to shoot there because the light's so difficult to control on exteriors all the time. In that part of Ireland, the clouds, no clouds, sun, all day long, trying to do big scenes outside, very difficult. After 6 weeks, we were supposed to move up to Dublin, and Stanley said, why don't we shut down? Ken can find the locations, I can write the script, and let's start again in January. Stanley was more interested in the weekly running costs than a weekly schedule. He wanted the smallest crew possible, want the minimum amount of people, minimum amount of distraction for the artists and everybody, And then Ken had to leave the film because he wasn't too well after Christmas that year. And Roy Walker took over and did the rest of the movie. And then we had this incident.
We had an IRA threat to Stanley and his family.
He received a threat that he would be kidnapped, and he did not intend to battle this out. He was not a man of principle to that extent, you know. And so he said, oh, well, forget it, I don't need this, you know, and off he went.
We all came back to Salisbury, and then we operated from Salisbury for the rest of the movie, really, just moving around from that as a base.
Or a person like me, being one of the Lord Ludd seconds, having to say no dialogue, or an extra just coming in for the day. He was very, very strong in his views.
We cast Ryan O'Neill because he thought, and Warner Brothers thought, that for a film of this magnitude, you want to have a star name. And Ryan was a big star at that time.
What, may I ask, is the price of this one?
Well, this is one of my best pictures. But if you really like it, I'm sure...
Ryan had really kind of got himself into the real character, like a lot of actors today. He didn't want to be called Ryan or Mr. O'Neill. He wanted to be called Lord Lyndon or Barry Lyndon.
Marissa Berenson, we saw her in Cabaret, and we thought she was just brilliant. Yeah, and she looks great, and she's a fantastic figure. And so that was the two principles.
The casting process, it was on videotape. It was the first time I'd ever seen that or come across it. But in actual fact, for me, I thought, this is great, because I'm not trying to impress a person in the room. I mean, Stanley was never there for audition. It left me feeling much freer.
I remember flying to Ireland for a costume fitting and also to meet Stanley for the first time. And I just remember it was very quick, but it made a massive impression because he was like smiling and very warm, and I automatically felt very comfortable, and he did make you feel interesting and wanted and special. And that was my first impression of Stanley.
The very first time when I got to the set or where they were shooting, and I said, well, can I have a script? Because it hadn't been sent out. And they gave me a script. And on the first page, it said, you know, Barry fights a duel with, scene to be written. And page 2 is scene 2, scene to be written. And I sort of went through this whole script, and every scene was to be written. And I thought, well, what's going, weird. But as it went on and the film sort of developed, that he was able to work out through this sort of exploratory process that he had, and also gave him a lot of thought so that the film could radically be very different from whatever script you had in your hand in the first place. Because Stanley rehearsed so much, it was to let you find the character, or get something inside the character that was going to make a difference. It's a little bit of, exaggeration to always talk about, the endless takes. I mean, we did do sometimes endless takes. You see, so much of it was a rehearsal, and so much of it was over and over again to sort of get the, the feeling right, the temperature. He never knew how he was going to shoot a scene when we walked on set. But that kind of working meant that he could find a first angle, first shot. And out of that first shot, everything else would grow. And so by the time you got to actually perform the scene, when the camera was running, somehow the whole pretense of acting had fallen away. It became a natural part of you. It meant you weren't remembering lines or dialogue. You knew the dialogue.
I have borne, as long as mortal could endure, the ill treatment of the insolent Irish upstart whom you've taken into your bed.
I'd never worked that way before, and I just thought it was magic.
Lord Bullingdon, take good care of your mother.
One of the first scenes that I was in, it was my first sort of proper encounter with Barry Lyndon. And it's where I refuse to kiss him.
My father was Sir Charles Lyndon.
That for me on the page started out as something very aggressive, like, you're not my, shouting at this man, He told me how to rethink it in such a gentle way. I didn't quite know what he meant, but I remember the one, and it stuck in my head ever since. He said, try and be a little less melodramatic. And I remember him staring at me and giving me that advice. But he calmed you down. He made the creative environment very safe.
You should be happy that your mother has remarried.
Not in this way.
He was also interested in what you were doing naturally. He observed and he picked up on things. It was about allowing that thing that he wanted to come out, and no one knew really what it was. And when he saw it, you knew it. And this is what I really appreciated about the way he worked, was that, you know, scenes evolved. They weren't what was on the page.
In England during that time, the way you appeared actually showed your wealth. So, for instance, the lace cuffs, which were very, very expensive, you had to display it. And then the actual clothes that you wore weren't really physically friendly. They made you into a pose. It was about showing, you know, ostentatiousness in your lifestyles, and that immediately sort of make a difference to whoever was beneath you. And they always thought about it as being beneath them.
Lord Patrick Plunkett was the Queen's equerry. He got special permission from the Queen to come and be with our technical advisor when we were in England on film, saying that's how the aristocrats, that's how they hold a knife.
Lord Patrick Plunkett, who was an old friend of mine, I put him on to Stanley. He was delighted to help us, and we got most of our big house permissions from Patrick. He, in fact, played a part in the film. He was the person who introduced Barry Lyndon to court at Goodwood House.
Good. Your Majesty, may I present Mr. Barry Lyndon?
Your Majesty. Mr. Lyndon?
When Barry Lyndon, he had to be introduced to the King. Stanley had a field phone on a long lead. And he said, I really would love to know from Her Majesty how a person really is presented to her or to a king. So Patrick Plunkett said, well, I'll call Her Majesty. So we saw Patrick talking to the Queen on the phone and Stanley saying, can you ask Her Majesty this and ask her that? Then turn around, Majesty, would you like to have a word with Stanley? And Stanley did actually speak to her.
I think the Queen was very amused to hear all the stories of how we operated. It's a little different.
Brian and I, we managed to get some real aristocratic people through an aristocratic lady, a lady called Lady Snow, and her husband, who was a Viscount. They knew a lot of the people. An aristocratic lady walks different than some young girl working in a supermarket. Of course. An aristocratic gentleman walks differently than somebody who's working on a bus. Well, we went to Blenheim Palace to do an outside scene, seeing the English gentry relaxing. The aristocratic, we made sure that they were closest to the camera. We got jockeys to be jockeys.
It was encouragement, and we'd sort of have fun together. It was a pleasure to be with him, because when we were doing a scene together, he was left on, you know, for about 3 weeks. It was just limp.
I really liked Ryan. I hated him as my character, but as a person, I really liked him. And we would play a lot and have games and fun. I remember what upset me more than the actual whipping was the fact that he had to be this tough person on me. And I was used to him being nice and friendly, and then suddenly he wasn't.
6.
I remember Stanley, he had 2 cameras running to capture the moment when I genuinely got upset and cried.
Lord Bullingdon.
When we came to the brawl in the ballroom, that was another one I was probably a little bit worried about, because I didn't know quite how far we were going to go. Ryan was surprisingly gentle in the brutality of it all. That Stanley said, Brian, it doesn't look like you're hitting him hard enough. And I think he's hitting me hard enough. It'll do, you know.
Redmond Barry assumed the style and title of Barry Lyndon.
Filming always carriage scenes. It's very difficult because they're very noisy with the horses.
Graham? We tried a car, first of all, to pull us on a big dolly. But there was a problem with that. The driver, he couldn't keep to a constant speed that Stanley needed for consistency.
And so we have to have the guys pulling it. We spent the whole day running, pulling that bloody carriage, about 12 of us, until everyone was completely knackered. And then we get 12 more in there. Oh, it was horrendous. That was a Stanley special for us.
If Stanley came onto a set and he still wasn't 100% happy with it, it doesn't matter how many people we would have there or how many actors, he would decide there and then we'll do it another day. When Stanley was making a film, you've got to be prepared. You could be involved for 1 year, whether you're me or whether you're one of the actors, because he takes his time.
It is an endurance test with Stanley, but it's exactly the same as being with David Lean. You find with these directors who make films only occasionally, once they have all their old mates around them, they tend to keep them there for a long time, and you can't particularly get away.
Thank God I'd worked on all those difficult movies before Stanley Kubrick. Otherwise, I don't think I would have lasted.
But Stanley always had questions for you about everything, every day, you know, a huge list of things you should be doing or supposed to have been doing.
Always write everything down. You're not a computer. Write everything down. And he would say, now, Michael, 2 weeks ago on the 4th of May, Monday at 11 a.m. on the set, I asked you, when would I be able to see Marisa, Lady Lyndon, funeral wig? When was it ready for me to see? You haven't come back to me, and that was 2 weeks ago. What happened?
You had to sort of really do all sorts of different things that would be most unusual. It made life a piece of cake when you go on a normal film.
It would require a great philosopher and historian to explain the causes of the famous 7 Years' War.
Because I knew quite a lot of commercial guys, Stanley wanted me to give him a list of people I thought would be good to direct the second unit. We talked to Adrian Lyne, who was a good friend of mine, Ridley Scott, Tony Scott, Hugh Hudson, and Alan Parker, who were the top guys of that time and probably would be the top guys at any period of time. But availability was a problem with all of those guys. And then we decided, well, we're better off doing it ourselves, because it was easier for Stanley to sort of bollock us than, you know, some poor bloke who, you know, didn't really know what he was getting into. Dougie Milsom and myself. We went off and did it all, and it worked very well.
You can't film everything in Ireland or in England if the story takes you to Germany. You have to also, for the audience, you have to show we are now at a different place. So we hired Jan Schluber, who is a well-established and well-connected German art director. And then he goes and photographs the places. We give it back to Stanley, and he decides which of the suggested locations he really likes.
We went with the second unit, just a few of us, to Germany, where a lot of the castles and rumbais and things like that we shot there, and Potsdam.
The most interesting one was Potsdam. These were the administrative buildings of Frederick the Great. There's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. After some exchanges, they invited me to go to East Berlin. The script of Barry Lyndon was confiscated at the border, but once the formalities were taken care of with the political side, it went like a dream. It was fantastic. They took all the communist propaganda flags off the buildings, removed the telephone box, put gravel on the street, got the horses from the stable, including the period gear that the horses wear, and a coach or two from the museums. I mean, they were extremely helpful once the first hurdle of making sure that Barry Lyndon was not an anti-communist propaganda film had been resolved.
Daddy wanted to send a second unit to Castle Howard. So I went up there and my instructions were get the master shot. So I photographed the whole area with the lake and the house in the background and, and composed it nicely so that he could give an 8x10 to the second unit photographer, said, so shoot it from this angle. So that was quite a huge responsibility, really. I did lots of little things. Second unit, writing Lady Lyndon's checks out for Redmond Barry. But what was really embarrassing was that Marisa Berenson was very tiny and very slim, and I could barely fit my arm down the sleeve of her costume.
What has happened here?
When we had the kid come off the horse, I said, well, let's shoot it, whatever happens. It's only a test for us, and let's see what happens. And the kid went up, and the horse went right back over and crashed down. And in fact, very luckily, never caught the little boy. We had a look at the replays, and I said, we'll never get better than this. I called Stanley, and he said, well, don't be so ridiculous. Bring it up here to the house and let me have a look at it. I said, well, it's good, Stanley. And, of course, took it up to him. He had a look at it. He said, well, you might have got something right for a change here. And he was always very good on that sort of stuff. No ego on other people shooting things for him. It didn't worry him at all, as long as the material was good.
Well, the duel scene, Stanley had to drive it up to the pitch of emotion because somebody wants to kill somebody. He suddenly realized, I know. He said, you're going to vomit. So I thought, well, I can't vomit on Will. So he said, okay, well, we'll plan it. So we're going to shoot it after lunch. And for lunch, I was given this cocktail of cold soup, sort of chicken and tomato all mashed up together. The chicken was cooked, I'll give them that. And, sort of olive salad-y stuff. It was just absolutely, you could have modeled a house out of it. It was so gooey and gummy and disgusting. And we got into position and, it was, okay, action. And it was like, oh, I feel all right now. What am I going to do? I couldn't be sick. And he said to the props, bring him the raw egg. They got an egg from the caterer's truck and they cracked it open. They put it in this cup. And he said, okay, when I say action, you swallow that raw egg, okay? And then you run to that wall to vomit. And I said, oh, okay. All right. So he said, action. I drank it. And it was like, immediately, it was like it went down and bounced up. And I thought, oh, no, we're going to have to do this again. We're going to have to do this again. And he said, no, it's perfect. It's perfect. You vomited because you had to vomit, and it works. And so that was the only time I only did one take for a scene I was shooting.
All of the attempts to keep the budget within a reasonable limit didn't work with the production on Barry Lyndon. In April 1974, Warner Brothers are already estimating that the film is going to cost $3 million more than they had initially budgeted for, and eventually the film cost around about $11 million in total.
Stanley was very budget-minded, absolutely. He didn't like the idea at all of going over budget. But in the very end, he had to be satisfied with what he delivered.
Kubrick had different ideas about how he wanted to do the soundtrack and the music. There's a list where he's specifying specific tracks that he's interested in. Saraband is already on there, Fantasia is on there, but also he's listing film composers. Rotor is on there. Morricone is contemplated. He doesn't seem to have decided until late August 1975 that he's actually going to use all pre-recorded existing classical music.
Kubrick was a very musical man himself and had a broad knowledge of music. In Barry Lyndon, it was different. I mean, the choices are enormous. You have the whole repertoire of 18th century music. So on Barry Lyndon, I did a lot of research. I was very involved with the score, suggesting music. I was not involved in making the decision. I can't underline this strongly enough, but I loved it. It was a side job of me, and I was feeding him music. And then he said, oh, yes, I like this. Get me more of that. Didn't bring Warner Brothers their money back. In case of Barry Lyndon, this was a problem because Barry Lyndon was expensive and was badly received in the United States and Canada and the English-speaking world, basically.
Stanley was really emotionally hurt. He said to me, he said, what do people want from a movie? I mean, he just didn't understand it, you know, because a lot of it was kind of thoughtless criticism. But it's a radically different feeling about the film now.
It was really the first movie that I had worked on as an adult. So I thought all movies were made that way. So when I went on to have a film career of my own and work for other directors, I thought they were being really sloppy.
Yeah, he was different to any other director I'd worked with before, and he's different to any other director that I've worked with since.
I think he was the premier filmmaker of the 20th century. I mean, he spanned it beautifully. 1928, he was born. 1999, he died.
There'll never be another Stanley Kubrick. His legacy will live forever, I think.
You see, the proof is that all his films remain. And what is a great work of art? A great work of art, whether it's a novel or a painting or a composition or a sculpture or a film, is that it doesn't disappear. Well, and his films do not disappear.